Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. What is the fate of the House of Saud? Its list of complaints against Washington, Riyadh's well-known protector, is long and getting longer. The Saudis are furious over Western dealings with Iran, disappointed that Obama didn't bomb Syria, and determined to export its radical form of Islam. And one of its only real friends in the region is Israel. Given all of this, can the House of Saud afford what it calls an independent foreign policy? To CrossTalk Saudi Arabia, I'm joined by my guest, Becker in Washington. He is the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition. And in Nashville, we cross to Mark Levine. He is a senior fellow with the Truman National Security Project and a radio show host. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Brian, is it time for Washington to tell Saudi Arabia to pound sand?
Well, I think it's been long established that the U.S. government considers the Saudi government to be an indispensable ally, not its only ally, and perhaps now not its principal ally, but certainly an important one. Ronald Reagan made it clear more than 30 years ago that there would be, quote, no revolution in Saudi Arabia because the U.S. was just absolutely determined to keep the absolutist monarch in power there, not because they care so much about what's going on inside of Saudi Arabia, but because they consider it to be essential as the main oil exporter in the world and a geostrategic ally. But of course, the Saudi government has other things to worry about. Principally, it's an unstable regime in the way Saudi society has been organized. It's a distorted society, and it fears revolutions either from a secular opposition or, more importantly, from an Islamic opposition. And so in that sense, the Saudi government is always pursuing a foreign policy and a domestic policy based on sort of existential fear that the regime's days, although it seemed omnipotent a while ago, could in fact be numbered.
That's a good point. Mark, the days are numbered for the House of Saud. Are they a good bet for Washington? 30 years ago, I understand. I agree with Brian. I mean, unfortunately, that was the reality there. But a lot of things have changed in the last 30 years. A lot of things have changed in the last 2 years.
I would argue that in the Arab world, one of the most unstable areas of the world, Saudi Arabia is one of the most stable. You look at almost any other Arab country, name it, Libya,
Mark,
Egypt, Tunisia, Syria,
is it stable
and they're having an Arab Spring, they're falling apart.
Is it stable because of tyranny? Is that it, stability?
Well, actually, there's less tyranny in Saudi Arabia than other countries. Look, I'm not saying that Saudi Arabia is some free and open place. Their treatment of women, obviously, is terrible there. But compared to Syria, where hundreds of thousands are being massacred by Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian government and al-Qaeda moving in, and Iraq and Libya and Tunisia, yes, Saudi Arabia is a beacon of stability compared to all the other unstable places there.
Okay, Brian, if I can go back to you. But, I mean, Syria is unstable because of Saudi Arabia, and it's exporting its jihadists.
No, not because of Saudi Arabia.
That is so well documented. No, let me go to Brian. That is so well documented right now. And it's one of the reasons why I'm doing this program is because the U.S. is supporting people that are against its own national interests. Brian first, then we'll go to Mark. Go ahead, Brian.
You know, Mark's comments are somewhat laughable, I would say. Remember when Jimmy Carter stood next to the Shah of Iran in 1977 and said, "Shah, you are an island of stability in a sea of turmoil." And the U.S. premised its foreign policy based on being connected hip to joint with the Shah at that time. That was 2 years before the government was overthrown by a popular people's revolution. Of course, Saudi Arabia has fomented civil war in Syria. It had a principle, a fundamental desire to overthrow the Assad government, to create a Sunni government that would be backed by the Saudi regime. It did this in concert with Qatar and others. It functioned as a proxy, of course, for the United States and Western interests who had said Assad must go. But Saudi Arabia had its own independent national interests, or perceived national interests, or the interests of the monarchy that drove it to carry out civil war. The blood of the Syrian people is on the hands of the Saudi government. So to say that they're this kind of emblematic
Assad
of stability,
hundreds of thousands,
that's just
blaming Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Mark.
Crazy.
Mark, go ahead. This is CrossTalk. We're going to be fair.
That's like blaming
Mark.
the United States for the Holocaust. Look, the Syrian government has been massacring hundreds of thousands of people.
That's just random. That's random.
I've been on your show many times, Peter. For 3 or 4 years ago, I came on your show. It was a peaceful revolution. The Syrian government mowed them down in the streets. They take out innocent men, women, and children, shoot them down. They don't allow any humanitarian aid.
So what is the role of the Saudis? Mark, what's the role of the Saudis then?
I'll tell you the role.
Go ahead.
There's been a long-time battle between Shia and Sunni Muslims. It's existed for 1,000 years. It existed in the Iran-Iraq War. Saudi Arabia is leading the Sunnis. Iran is leading the Shias. In Syria, of course, you have a Sunni majority country ruled by a Shia Iranian-backed minority.
So why should Washington be involved in all of this?
Saudi Arabia's coming in to defend the Sunnis.
Why should Washington be backing the sectarian difference? Go ahead. Go ahead, Mark.
They should be backing the peaceful rebels there because and doing it through a no-fly zone, by the way, not through arms. Because right now it's all going to end up, frankly, being an Al-Qaeda or Iranian satellite there.
Brian, jump in.
You know what? It's an act of war.
Brian, jump in.
Let's stop being real.
Talk over each other. Brian.
Look, let's be real. Let's be real, if I could. A no-fly zone means you have to carry out through the U.S. and NATO air forces, the ability to destroy the Syrian air defenses. A no-fly zone means the U.S. would, unlike what it's doing right now, which is preparing for another round of negotiations, be doing what the Saudis wanted them to do last summer, which is to further take that step towards a full-scale military engagement with the Syrian government and with its allies. A no-fly zone is not a peaceful alternative to war. It's a step towards war. It's an active step towards war. The Saudi government is pursuing
you don't give a damn about the hundreds of thousands of people being murdered. That's fine.
But please don't call an act of war to stop those murders.
All right, Jan, let's stay with Saudi Arabia here. Mark, I'm going to go to Mark now. You know, Mark, okay, I'll take what you're saying at face value. You know, the Saudis are trying to protect civilians. But they backed Saddam in a war against Iran, where almost estimates say up to 1 million people. So you're saying that the Syrian blood's more valuable than Iranian blood. That's what you're saying, because it doesn't make any sense to me.
What I'm saying is the Saudis and the Iranians are in a battle. It's the old Sunni-Shia battle. You've got Egypt and Turkey involved as well. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons. Then Turkey will get nuclear weapons. And Egypt will get nuclear weapons. Then Iraq will get nuclear weapons. Al-Qaeda will get nuclear weapons. The entire regime will get nuclear weapons. The whole area will. Look, this is a battle for hegemony. There's no question about it.
Okay.
The Saudis care about the Syrian people because they're Sunnis.
But maybe if I can go to Brian, maybe it would be better if the United States had a good relationship with Iran and get rid of that. Drop this authoritarian, tyrannical regime called Saudi Arabia. Maybe it'd be a better bet.
The U.S. government right now, by engaging even in the first step of negotiations with the Iranian government over its nuclear program, or really about the unfreezing in a modest way of some of the sanctions, not most of them, against Iran, it raises the specter, both for Israel and for the Saudi government, that there could be, in fact, a shift in U.S. policy towards the Middle East. The specter of peace between the United States and Iran is something that creates horrors inside the bedrooms of the Saudi royal family, because they realize if there was any sort of rapprochement or détente or accommodation between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran, the government, instead of, for instance, constantly and endlessly seeing it only from the vantage point of regime change, if there was some sort of an accommodation, it would mean the Saudi monarchy's role from the vantage point of U.S. geostrategic interests would be less necessary. Saudi Arabia could start to drop out of the equation. Not fully. That's what the Israelis fear as well. They see constant war, tension, the threat of war as being very useful for them, because it means they're more important for the empire, more important for the empire's hold on this resource-rich and geostrategically part of the world.
Okay, Mark, go ahead. Mark, go ahead.
I wish that people would stop playing Risk. Pretend like it's some geopolitical game where you put an army here and you put an army there. I support the Iranian people who are against the regime. I support the Syrian people who are against the regime. I support the Saudi Arabian people. I think that each people needs a right to have their own destiny and not be forced by these tyrannical powers. Look, the Iranian government had no way relationship to the Iranian people. The Persian people are some of those pro-American, pro-Israeli people in the Middle East. That's not the problem. The problem is a regime,
the Iranian
and the regime that's supporting Hezbollah Hezbollah, that's supporting the terrorism throughout. And look, the Saudi regime has its own tyranny. Women in Saudi Arabia are not treated well either. There's virtually no democracy in the Middle East except Turkey and Israel.
All right,
I understand that.
All right,
but at the end of the day,
Mark, you brought up risk.
Mark,
you brought up the term risk, obvious reference to the game, but if I go to Brian, that's exactly what Saudi Arabia is playing in the region. It's playing risk with its money and supporting all kinds of crazy groups. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, and also and Mark forgot to mention that when the people of Bahrain rose up for democracy against the royal monarchy, which hosts the Fifth Fleet of the Pentagon, the Saudis moved in, and the Saudis moved in with brutal force with its army.
And
the
why
Washington
did they do that?
government
Because the
said
people are
nothing. They were
Shia
perfectly
and
happy
Saudi
with
is
that.
Sunni.
Mark?
At the end of the day, every people needs to have individual self-determination, whether Shia or Sunni. And a majority Shia country like Bahrain should be Shia. A majority Sunni country like Syria should be Sunni. And basically, if it weren't this geopolitical game between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Brian, before we go to, let me go to Brian before the break. Go ahead, Brian, before the break. Go ahead. Go ahead.
On Mark's premise, then, America should be a Christian nation and a white nation because it's the majority nation. I mean, that's completely opposed to any sort of basic tenet of democracy or freedom.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Saudi Arabia. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Saudi Arabia. Brian, if I can go back to you, in the beginning of the program, I mentioned that Saudi Arabia has given these signs and signals that it may want to pursue its own independent foreign policy, whatever that may be. I mean, without the United States and without Israel, even though publicly they're not allies, but in many ways they actually are allies, I mean, what can that mean for Saudi Arabia? Because I would agree with Mark on one point here, is it sees everything through the sectarian division. And this is one of the things I'm critical of Washington, is getting involved in something like that, because the United States is just brought in as some kind of mercenary army to settle conflicts on the ground. First, Brian, then we go to Mark.
Yes, let's first look at Saudi foreign policy based not on the Shiite-Sunni division, even though that's a factor. The fundamental part of their foreign policy is based on their own estimation of what the regime needs in order to stay in power. It is a fragile regime. It is an absolutist monarchy. It has been in power for 80 years. It has never had an election. 1/3 of all the people in Saudi Arabia are migrants. The Saudi population is dependent on migrant labor for work. That makes the regime completely unstable in its core, in its essence, in terms of its domestic policy, in spite of its oil wealth. So what it did over the long term was function as a proxy, as a client for the United States. In the recent years, after the onset of the so-called Arab Spring, the Saudi Arabians did pursue a more independent, aggressive foreign policy, trying to carry out regime change against others in the Middle East. But even when it did so with the United States, not against the United States. The United States and the Saudis had the same goal in Syria, which was to overthrow the Assad government. Now you see, because of a possible shift in the way the United States is approaching the Middle East, that Saudi Arabia fears isolation. They really cannot carry out an independent foreign policy because of the regime's limited strength and durability. It fears an Islamic revolution or a secular revolution. It fears isolation. And now it looks as if it's primarily the ally of Israel. I mean, you can't look for a worse outcome for a regime in the Arab world.
Mark, reply to that, because it does look like a Tel Aviv-Riyadh axis now developing, and there's been lots of sound and fury that they collectively could attack Iran if the United States and Western powers continue their dialogue with Tehran. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to say I agree with the first part of what Brian had to say with regard to the fact that, yes, a third is migrant workers. Yes, they're paying off people with oil wealth. But the idea that Saudi Arabia is somehow a client state of the United States, I completely disagree with. They have independent interests that often coincide with the United States. And Saudi Arabia can pursue an independent foreign policy. If Iran, for example, were to get nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would have nuclear weapons probably within a month because of their alliance with Pakistan. In fact, many people think that Pakistan got their nuclear weapons because of Saudi money. So if there is a nuclear arms race, Saudi Arabia will be right there after Iran. It's one of the reasons why I support the current Iran deal, because I think it is the best chance we have to prevent this nuclear arms race from happening. But please don't pretend that Saudi Arabia somehow is independent, somehow is the United States client state. They're a very independent place. They are pursuing their own interests. The fact that they're joining with Israel tells you that they're doing what they need to do to survive, not because they like Israel, but because the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Okay, Brian, this has nothing to do with a nuclear Iran, does it? It has, what it's all about is a détente, possible détente, with Tehran in the outside world to stop isolating it. This is the worst nightmare for Saudi Arabia and Israel since it's already been mentioned. It's not about a nuclear weapon. This is such a fiction.
It's all about nuclear weapons.
It's not the specter of a nuclear.
Let me go to Brian. Mark.
It's not the specter.
Go ahead.
It's not the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran. It's the specter of a peaceful accommodation between the U.S. and Iran. And that's the main danger for the Saudi government. That's how they perceive it. The Iranian government does not have a nuclear weapon. The Iranian government is the most inspected society. It has IAEA inspectors in there every day. It has now said that it won't enrich uranium past 5%, meaning it's impossible for it to acquire a nuclear weapon. In other words, there's nothing, and Iran has not initiated a war with any of its neighbors. So it's not a nuclear-armed Iran, and it's not an aggressive Iran. It's really the possibility of an accommodation with Washington that scares the Saudi monarchy.
Please don't say it's not an aggressive war.
Go ahead, Mark.
To say that Iran's not an aggressive war when they're arming Hezbollah, which is murdering hundreds of thousands of Syrians,
I said they haven't initiated any
when they're arming
war.
Hamas.
Mark, and it's Israel.
Of course they have.
And because of Israel's actions in Lebanon, Hezbollah came into being, okay? We can go around and around on this here, okay? Let's stay with Saudi Arabia here. Brian, what is the best case scenario about the future of the House of Saud? Because a lot of people would tend to agree with you. It's a very unstable regime. It has a lot of money. And I would agree with Mark. In less than a month, they can buy a nuclear weapon. How do you feel about Riyadh having a nuclear weapon? I'm more afraid of that than Iran having a weapon. Go ahead. Go ahead, Brian.
I don't think they can get a nuclear weapon. I don't think, even though the Saudis helped finance the Pakistan nuclear arms project, it's not like the Pakistan military is going to say, oh, and here's your bomb, by the way. I just don't see that happening. I think the best case scenario for the Saudi family, the royal family, is there's no best case there. I think they can look back in history and see Louis XVI or the Shah of Iran, all the other monarchs who finally end up in the dustbin of history, and they know it. They know that their days are numbered. And so all of this attempted appearance of omniscience, all of this power of projecting an independent foreign policy, underneath it all, in spite of its vast wealth, in spite of its vast military, it's a fragile regime. It can be toppled. I think it will be toppled ultimately.
They're all fragile.
Go ahead, Mark.
Every government in that era. Every government in the Middle East, except Turkey and Israel, because they're democracies, every single other government is fragile. You look at a fairly stable country like Jordan, it is fragile as well. My hope for Saudi Arabia is to become a constitutional monarchy more like Jordan, but Saudi Arabia has lots of work to do. You're absolutely right. Its citizens have power, but its workers are not their citizens. Women have very few rights in Saudi Arabia. I'm not defending the Saudi regime, and I'm not saying that they're stable. I'm saying they're more stable than virtually every other regime in the Middle East, and that's not a compliment to Saudi Arabia. It's really an insult to all the instability in the Middle East because of this conflict, because of the Shia-Sunni conflict, because of the dictatorship.
Okay, Brian, jump in.
No, the Saudi society is rotting from within. There's 12% unemployment amongst the Saudi youth, the young people who have graduated.
Is it better in Yemen?
2 million migrants have been... 2 million migrants have been deported in the last year. The society is now rife with extreme racism. Society knows that it's lost its moorings, that it has no ability. But the Saudi government has no solution, because the only solution would include the liquidation of the monarchy, which the monarchy won't do for the obvious reasons.
You can't look at it in isolation.
Okay, Mark.
My point is this. I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying about Saudi Arabia.
No, Mark, I don't want to waste time on that. I want to ask Mark a question. Okay? I mean, obviously, I think all three of us can agree on one thing, is that the so-called values of the royal family of Saudi Arabia have nothing to do with anything that any of us would find in common whatsoever, okay? But there is a commonality there, Mark, and it's called American arms. They love Saudi Arabia, don't they? And this is one of the things that the Saudis are threatening the Americans. The arms makers in the U.S. have a lot of influence in Washington. This is what's keeping it together, at least for now. What do you think?
Saudi Arabia does like American arms. The Egyptian dictatorship of Mubarak certainly liked American arms. There's no question about it. Yes, Bahrain does as well. We do arm dictators in the Middle East. I don't think anyone disputes that. My point is that Saudi Arabia is less dangerous than virtually all the others. That's no praise to Saudi Arabia. It's telling you it's the best.
Really
it's the best
cold
apple
comfort to the people in Syria.
Of apples.
That's really cold comfort to the people in Syria.
But Syria, you can't blame Saudi Arabia for Syria. That's really silly. I mean, when the people of Syria rose up non-violently, were mowed down by their government and tanks and mortars. Remember, Syria doesn't even allow the Red Cross to go in because they're massacring people day and night. Saudi Arabia has done many bad things, but if anything in Syria,
Mark,
they're trying
I'd like to go to Brian. I'll tell you one of the bad things that Saudi Arabia does. It sends its young people with tickets on airplanes and money in their pocket, and they go across the border with the acquiescence of the Turks. This is what they're doing for the Syrian people. This is the export of Saudi ideology and violence. Mark. Okay, Brian, jump in. Sorry. Brian, jump in. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so the Saudi, I mean, if you look at the past 35 years, the Saudi royal family has been a funnel through which oil money, but also CIA money has gone to the most reactionary forces in South Central Asia, in Afghanistan, with Osama bin Laden, in Pakistan, and then to the same al-Qaeda forces in Syria. The Saudi royal family, of course, does pursue its own policy. It has its own networks of support. They're very, very reactionary. They're very reactionary towards workers, towards unions, towards women, towards all the things that people equate with freedom.
Here's the point.
And in the case of Saudi Arabia, by the way, Mark says the Saudis are less of a threat. The question is to whom? Certainly not to the Syrians. If you go to Saudi Arabia, Mark, if you go there, you'll see wanted posters for migrant workers up in the wall because they're enslaved people by the Saudi royal family. It's very threatening. It's very threatening
I'm not
for them.
defending Saudi Arabia.
This is a society that's based on enslavement.
Okay.
It's based on feudalism and enslavement and monarchism.
Okay, Mark, go ahead. Mark, I'm going to ask you a quick question. I'm going to ask Mark, I'm going to give you the last word of the program because we're almost out of time, and I'm going to give you the last word. So you prefer to have a cozy relationship with Saudi Arabia and not have a détente with Iran? Go ahead, 40 seconds.
I prefer neither. Saudi Arabia and Iran are both dictatorial regimes. They both arm terrorists. They're both engaged in the Sunni-Shia battle, and they're both destroying peoples throughout the Middle East. I think the people themselves should decide. That's why I support the Syrian rebels and the Bahrainian rebels. And throughout the Middle East, I support the Arab Spring because I think there is a third way between the two horrors of Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Mark, let's keep in mind that people in Iran go to elections on a regular basis, and there's a plurality of political
they don't. They're not allowed to vote for who they want.
We've run out of time, gentlemen. I want to thank many thanks to my guests in Washington and in Nashville, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.